Okay, I think maybe we can start. Jason?
Sure.
Yep. Okay, great. I will start then. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. My name is Erica Allen Kim, and I am the host for today's Daniel's lecture, Globes, Stock Markets, and Speculative Capitalism by Jason Nguyen. In light of today's topic on speculation, I would like to acknowledge that the city has been shaped in profound ways according to a logic of capitalism that runs counter to the values of many nations on whose traditional land the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, diverse nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, have called this land their home, and is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Most of us are immigrants or descendants of settlers, and the Indigenous scientist Robin Wall-Kimmerer reminds us that being a good neighbor means an ongoing commitment to both self-reflection and action. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and we honor Indigenous communities by actively participating in truth and reconciliation. Joining us today is Jason Nguyen, who is an architectural historian here at the Daniels faculty, who works at the junction of architecture, science, and technology, and political economy in the early modern world. He is completing the manuscript for his first book, Theory and Expertise, The Art of Building in Old Regime France. The project charts the theorization of technical practice in 17th and early 18th century France and the way in which architects claimed expertise through mechanical philosophy. More recently, Jason's interests have centered on architecture's relationship to global capitalism and the environment. He is working on a book-length study of European-supported entrepôts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas as they relate to early modern shipping networks and the formalization of the stock exchange. The project ties these complexes to contemporaneous technologies such as cartography and the deterritorialization of indigenous seascapes in the development of global capitalism and empire. Jason received his PhD in the history and theory of architecture from Harvard University. His work has appeared in edited volumes and journals such as Grey Room, Livraison d'Histoire de l'Architecture, and Oxford Art Journal. He has taught at Harvard, the University of Southern California, and the University of California, Los Angeles. Prior to his scholarly career, he practiced architecture at Venturi, Scott Brown and Associates in Philadelphia. In addition to his early modern research, he has interests in post-war architecture and theory, commerce and neoliberal economics, and the Vietnam War and its cultural legacy. The format for today's event will be a presentation from Jason with Q&A at the end. We ask that you keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation. During the Q&A, please type your questions in the chat. Alternatively, you can identify yourself in the chat as someone who wants to ask a question, and we can unmute you. This lecture is being recorded and broadcast on our YouTube channel. Please turn off your camera if you do not wish to be recorded. I would now like to invite Jason to begin.
Thank you very much, Erica. And thank you to everyone out there in the Zoom space, for sure. It's been a pleasure to join the faculty here at Daniels, even if under rather auspicious terms and auspicious times. But I would like to thank all of the new colleagues I have here who have been nothing but generous, especially Vivian Lee and Mason White, who generously extended me the opportunity to introduce myself and some of my work here today. Now, as Erica said, I'm an architectural historian, and what I'd like to do today is to share just the early stages of that new project, which looks at maritime infrastructure or the maritime infrastructure of speculative capitalism in the early modern world. While much research on this topic has focused on banks, highlighting the significance of the Bank of England, for which Sir John Soane oversaw construction from 1788 to 1833, where much of the research has been on issues of banks. My project, or what I am beginning the works of here, will instead focus on a series of European-supported entrepôts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, as Erica said, as they relate to shipping networks and the formalization of the stock exchange, notably in Amsterdam and London. As said, the project will tie these complexes to issues of cartography and navigation, questions of trade, marine ecologies, and the deterritorialization of indigenous seascapes. Today, I would like to sketch actually the parameters of this work by looking at a small handheld globe from 1719 by the British cartographer Herman Moll. These so-called pocket globes, named as such because one could supposedly fit them in one's pocket, they were popular commodities and functioned in the 18th century as status symbols for prosperous individuals and educational tools for their children. In this example, as we see here, geographic regions are toned in reds and greens, with areas unknown to European eyes, often illustrated incorrectly, if at all. Certainly you can see here, Australia labeled as New Holland, the eastern coast of it missing completely. If one looks at more closely, one can see that actually California is depicted as an island, and northwestern Canada tapers away toward the note that reads parts unknown. Between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, or within the tropics, small hatch marks depict the direction of the trade winds, the prevailing equatorial easterlies that facilitated early modern sea travel to the Americas. A dashed line, which you can see amid the trade winds, charts the maritime journeys by the English buccaneer, William Dampier. The 3-inch sphere fits within a hinged wooden case, which we see here on the left, whose interior maps the constellations. Now, Moll manufactured pocket globes, these pocket globes, for a very short period of time, simply during the 1710s through the second decade of the 18th century, when these objects were at their most fashionable in Britain. Drawing from earlier Dutch and English examples, cartographers produced these items for a growing consumer base fascinated by globalism and cartography, stemming in part from British imperial expansion and the extensive literature on nautical travel and adventure. As one of the foremost cartographers of the day, he for a period served as cartographer to the king, Moll engraved maps for scientific and literary works, including those by Dampier and Daniel Defoe, and produced his own books, periodicals, and prints. In 1718, he began to print The World Described, an atlas of some 24 double folio maps of regions around the globe. Broadly speaking, these projects collectively provided an enduring cartographic image of the British Empire to Moll's clientele. Now, at the time, London was a major center of mapmaking, given its standing as an important scientific hub and as the capital of a growing empire. There, Moll was part of an elite intellectual circle that included Dampier and Defoe, as well as Jonathan Swift, John Locke, and Robert Hooke, among many others. And they convened at Jonathan's Coffee House, which we see depicted here on the top left corner, which was the famed meeting place on Exchange Alley, or the kind of Wall Street or Bay Street of its day. That was the site of financial speculation and stockbroking for the city's money's investors. We see a map here on the right-hand side of London, specifically the city of London, which at the time, as it is today, the center of London's financial hub. Where all the streets converge is effectively where Bay Street Bank, the bank underground stop is. And on the left-hand side, an image of Jonathan's at the top. And at the bottom here on the left-hand side, effectively, you can see Change Alley, which is a kind of small alley that meandered through the neighborhood there. From his interlocutors, Moll gained prized information about natural history, navigation, and colonial trade, which he incorporated into his cartographic goods. And given that a pocket globe, as we see on the left, sold for an average of around 15 shillings, or about half the month's wage for a general laborer, one can assume that he intended them for a comfortable, if not elite, clientele. So for a prosperous subset of society, these luxury objects miniaturize the world, quite literally, that was becoming increasingly interconnected through exploration, trade, and the stock exchange. You can see here on the left-hand side, the Royal Exchange, which is depicted amid the city of London, obviously. Now, most historians of cartography have focused on Moll's maps, but what I'd like to do today is to center attention on his globes as a means to parse the relationship between early modern British consumerism and certain geopolitical developments that historians have seen as prescient of global modernity, namely speculative capitalism. So this talk argues that that the object's design and size, especially when considered alongside his contemporary books and maps, signal changes in both consumer behavior and political economy. And in this regard, their diminutiveness, they're simply 3 inches, reveals and conceals important and often disturbing aspects of modern capitalism as formalized at the time. Moll produced the small luxury items during one of the most turbulent decades in European political and economic history. Burdened by deficits stemming from the War of Spanish Succession, which spanned from 1701 to 14, Britain sponsored the creation of the South Sea Company in 1711. The Joint Stock Corporation, which I'll explain more in a bit, assumed the national debt, effectively loaning the money to the government, and the government agreed to make payments with interest of 5% back. In return, the parliament granted the company a monopoly on the trade of enslaved Africans to the Spanish Americas. Upon the encouragement of Swift, Defoe, Moll, and others, well-heeled investors at Jonathan's, as we saw on the left, purchased South Sea shares, hoping to profit from accrued interest on the government's loan and the company's overseas activities. During this period, Moll expanded his cartographic practice, selling pocket globes and writing 2 books to promote the company. These events, which coincided with the rise of consumerism in London, generated an unprecedented bubble that famously burst in the autumn of 1720. Unleashing a torrent of satirical imagery that ridiculed geography, globalism, and Europe's frenzied embrace of speculative capitalism and speculative investment. Well, In many ways, this moment birthed a specific mode of capitalism that united economics and race through global trade and the speculative investment in the stock market. The cost of an average pocket globe placed it out of reach for the everyday laborer, but certainly within the budget of London's emerging middling classes. During the late 17th and 18th centuries, England witnessed extraordinary growth in luxury consumption by individuals from different social and economic backgrounds. As miniaturizations of the world, they depicted the maritime infrastructure that generated European wealth, effectively giving rise to the modern world or the modern Western world. But at the same time, their size presumed a conspicuousness that catered to a population fascinated by the novelty of small decorative commodities. As such, they're unique lenses through which to examine the relationship between cartography, consumerism, and the burgeoning structures of global capitalism, along with their attendant connection to colonialism, the stock exchange, and slavery. Now, in London, the appeal of these pocket globes reflect the broadening of Britain's consumer base, as well as the commercial status of geography in early 18th century Britain. In his practice, Moll capitalized on 2 centuries of cartographic practice linked to global travel and colonialization. Early modern exploration had established a worldwide network of trade, which provided European map makers with information about places previously unknown. As consumer goods, these pocket globes gave domestic and consumer form to these operations, thereby integrating geopolitics into the private lives and social behaviors for the consumers. Now, I feel like I must mention the oldest known terrestrial globe dates actually to 1492 and bears a striking resemblance to the map that Christopher Columbus referenced to chart his travels across the Atlantic, firmly positioning cartography and globe manufacturing to colonial expansion. And on a more technical note, in the mid-16th century, the Flemish geographer Durandus Mercator began to incorporate engravings in globe manufacturing. He incised geographic data into gore-shaped copper plates, which you can see here on the top right, from which he made prints that could be cut out and assembled to make a sphere. And his eponymous technique of cartographic projection, which we see here on the left-hand side, which flattened converging lines of longitude so that it's parallel on a pictorial plane, was effectively the conceptual unraveling of a printed and assembled globe. You can see here on the bottom right, effectively how his technique of cartography was really the unraveling of the system. In addition to their functionality, maps and globes also promoted European colonization much more directly than this. A chart of the South Seas from Johannes van Coulen's popular atlas, The New Sea Torch, from the late 17th century, illustrates Dutch and English ships overpowering their Spanish adversaries here in the South Seas, which was a period term for the South Pacific. Now, during the period, English and Dutch philosophers actively encouraged overseas expansion in the name of the Reformed faith. And the connection between religion and colonialism is made evident by the image above the map's title, which we see blown up. Zierikzee is the name for South Sea in Dutch. And here, Van Coulen delineated how commerce, which we see as the allegorical woman at the top with the ship atop her head, buttressed by geography, which we can see on the globe, military valor, and the Reformed faith noted by the naked cross, would bring enlightenment to the South Seas. And the orientalizing depiction of Pacific Islanders scattered throughout contrasts with a kind of purified image of Protestant virtue. And the map suggests that access to the world's bounty, in fact, was the Protestants' reward for a life founded on reason and intellectual clarity, conditioned in a very self-serving sort of way that were refined through sea travel and trade. Most collaboration with established navigators or ship captains contributed to its commercial popularity. He engraved maps for William Dampier's popular A New Voyage Around the World from the end of the 17th century, which chronicled the latter's nautical journeys. Moll recycled this information from the map for later endeavors, despite important scientific realizations, notably the fact that geographers had since then confirmed Baja California's status as a peninsula and not an island. By the late 17th century, most European writers had abandoned their reliance on classical and biblical texts to explain foreign lands. As such, cartography supported an approach to natural history that privileged empirical observation and description. It's not surprising then that Daniel Defoe, the well-known economic theorist and novelist, turned to Moll to provide the maps for his Robinson Crusoe series, extremely popular at the time, and published in 1719. And at the beginning of the farther adventures of Robinson Crusoe, he reproduced Dampier's map, but replaced the buccaneer's path with that of Defoe's seafaring voyager. Now, in addition to all of these things, maps, globes, and atlases were also fashionable teaching aids. One 18th century atlas outlined how geography supported, quote, the education of young minds for young gentlemen, for the rustic, the time for self-education, for the merchant or general trader. And we can see here on the image on the right-hand side, on the painting showing a domestic scene of children, presumably the children of this couple, attending to cartography and learning geography, and certainly the map in the rear of England firmly positions this within England and kind of celebrating the growing British Empire. Now, the interest in geography was so widespread that one cartographer published a book that included a template to assemble a paper globe oneself. The circle on the upper left depicts the poles, and the gores. Gores are those kind of shapes that billow out on the sides. On the right, illustrate the areas between the lines of longitude. And this fabrication technique is actually discernible on Moll's pocket globe, noting the loss of paper at the Arctic Circle. Directed at the financially comfortable consumers and would-be travelers, these kinds of cartographic manuals and pocket globes help popularize scientific information that had previously been reserved for scholars and politicians, and they aided sociability, how one talks to one another, which has long been considered a force that contributed to secular modernity, while also embodying the ideology of European imperialism and colonial expansion. Now, cartography helped visualize the overseas activities that supported economic prosperity at home. In his economic text, Defoe categorized geography not as a humanist endeavor, but instead as a tool for the promotion of commerce, government, and empire. He conceived the world as a source of natural resources bound together by shipping and trade, certainly seen here on the image on the left. He conceived the world as, the merchant's duty was actually to manage the system of commodities in order to maximize national economic growth. From the 17th century onward, banks and trading corporations supported the government's fiscal and military operations through private investment, and Moll's cartographic images fueled the imagination of Britain's would-be shareholders by illustrating the colonial resources to be extracted and exchanged on the international market. Now, there were important historical circumstances that conditioned Defoe's economic theory. The Glorious Revolution of the late 17th century and the ascent of William and Mary ushered in a wave of political and economic reforms in Britain. To fund ongoing involvement in the 9 Years' War at the end of the 17th century, the state supported the creation of the Bank of England, which granted Westminster interest accruing loans to finance battle. Presuming the state's financial stability, private stakeholders purchased bank shares, which supported everyday operations and generated profits for investors based on interest revenue. The Bank of England and trading organizations like the East India Company, the Royal Africa Company, and certainly the Hudson Bay Company, which one knows well here in Toronto, fit within a broader European culture of financial speculation. In London, as we see here on the left, the Royal Exchange provided a venue for the market valuation of stocks and commodities. And at nearby coffee houses on Exchange Alley, financiers bought and sold shares, which generated a secondary market in Europe that was physically detached from the act of resource exploitation, effectively the birth of modern credit. And these efforts marked the beginning of a global risk society in a way where, like, the chance of peril itself became a commodity. Moll, who convened with his interlocutors at Jonathan's, produced a number of maps that celebrated the wealth to be gained through resource extraction and trade. His beaver map of North America visualized the fishing and fur industries and defended Britain's territorial claims against the French. We see it here. It's a double folio, so it's something quite large map. Actually, would be like double folded out. And the vignette, which Moll lifted from a print by the French cartographer Nicolas de Fer, showed beavers here felling and constructing a dam at the base of Niagara Falls. The scene itself promoted the fur trade, certainly the kind of attention to beavers themselves, promoted the fur trade, which supplied pelt for the European hat industry, while also stressing the Protestant virtue of labor for colonial settlement. Now, while Moll acknowledged here at the base of Lake Ontario the Iroquois presence, the allegorical inset nevertheless reinforced the perception of the Americas as a place of untapped abundance awaiting European cultivation. The cost to fund colonial expansion and a half century of war left many European nations on the brink of financial collapse. The costliest of these battles was the War of Spanish Succession, which concerned the future of the Spanish crown and by consequence, the control of its resource-rich American colonies. In 1711, at the beginning of the 18th century, the Tory statesman Robert Harley launched the South Sea Company, which absorbed the remainder of the nation's debt, which was about £9.5 million, in exchange for a monopoly on British trade in the Spanish Americas, effectively in the South Seas. Moll, the cartographer, was eager to capitalize on early interest among London's investors, and he published 2 books on the economic prospects of the joint stock venture. Like his pocket globes, the map that he produces focuses on maritime infrastructure and the importance of trade and exchange. So to drum up support among potential investors, Harley solicited aid from the influential voices on Exchange Alley, and Swift and Defoe both penned essays in support of the project. In a book written to promote the company, the book I mentioned previously, just a few seconds ago, Moll himself turned to natural history and cartography to promote the endeavor. South America, he writes, rich in flora, fauna, and material reserves, was already known to English navigators, notably through the voyages of Dampier. And by his assessment, Britain was well positioned to forge trading partnerships with the Hindu of Arauca and modern-day Colombia, and the Mapuche and Puren, which is in modern-day Chile, among others, who long resented the Spanish presence. Certainly, he refers to all of the different indigenous populations simply by the word Indian, so certainly not parsing that very deeply. And that the book concluded, actually, with a list of commissioners whom the reader can contact for company shares, highlights the commercial orientation of Moll's scientific study. So it's certainly not scientific analysis pure for curiosity purposes alone. And at the end of the book, Moll included a color-coded fold-out map of South America, seen here on the right. And the attention to waterways and ports confirms that Moll's focus was maritime trade. 9 inset maps ring the edge of the composition, including a distorted one at the upper right corner of the sheet that distorted the apparent distance between Europe and South America, visually minimizing it. The others illustrate regional harbors for possible British invasion. Moll demarcated the limits of the corporation's territorial waters in a dashed line that begins immediately south of Portuguese Brazil, which is toned in green, and continues around the Tierra del Fuego at the very bottom of the South American continent, which were the islands explored by Magellan in the 16th century, and extends north along the western coast of the Americas. Now, in reality, the South Sea Company made very few inroads into Spanish trading networks, and instead it functioned almost entirely as a front for the Atlantic slave trade, a fact understood and accepted by its early backers. And that period debates, or debates at the time, centered on the risk and returns of nautical travel, the likelihood that a ship may be lost at sea, for instance, as opposed to the life and subjectivity of enslaved Africans, illustrates a degree to which discourses on credit and wealth actively concealed the horrors of the slave trade of forced labor. Now, Moll acknowledged slaving activities by stressing the continent's port cities and on the far right side of the sheet, including the western tip of Africa. Atop the oceans, he denoted the prevailing east to west winds that facilitated early modern sea travel to the Americas, which he lifted from a recent study of Earth's maritime currents and magnetic field by Sir Edmund Halley. He cited the astronomer by name, thereby placing science in the explicit service of human trafficking. His note about Halley is at the very, very bottom at the kind of text outlined at the bottom of the map. Now, historians of cartography have struggled to position Moll's involvement in the South Sea Company. There's no evidence actually that exists that he invested in the company himself or actually profited from the endeavor. However, I think what's important is that the singular feature of Moll's cartographic enterprise, understood more broadly, is its commercial orientation. It's unlikely to be coincidental that the expansion of his business, which included pocket globes and the publishing of atlases, intersected with a financial experiment that promised to expand the city's consumer base. The design of his novelty globes, which recorded the period's nautical routes, port cities, trade winds, and the archaic term Negro lands, which we see here on both his globe and on a contemporaneous map he makes of Africa, nevertheless gestured toward the systems of capital, exploitation, and slavery that fueled British commercial growth. Now, the South Sea Company intensified its engagement with the slave trade following the War of Spanish Succession, which concluded in 1714. As part of the peace negotiations, Spain retained much of its American territories, but granted Britain a 30-year monopoly on the asiento, which was the contract that granted exclusive rights to provide enslaved laborers to the Spanish Americas. Queen Anne yielded these privileges to the South Sea Company with the arrangement that it transport 4,800 enslaved Africans per year and share 1/4 of the profits with the Spanish king. At the time, Moll produced a map that highlighted recent British incursions in the Caribbean, specifically the conquests of Barbados and Jamaica. The South Sea Company established headquarters on both islands. They're here illustrated in green. And on these islands, which Moll toned and labeled, and he toned and labeled them English. There, on these islands, attendants received slaving vessels from Africa, as illustrated by ships sailing toward Barbados on the map. There, they tabulated the number of enslaved people who had survived the horrors of the Middle Passage. And of those who remained, the healthiest were then sent to South America as part of the Asiento Agreement. The well-known image here on the left-hand side, which came from an abolitionist document from the end of the 18th century, illustrates a slaving vessel. And by color coding the map, that map of the West Indies of the Caribbean, according to British and Spanish-controlled territories, Moll granted it a practical function related to the slave trade. To exploit these new circumstances, Moll issued a second edition of his book on the South Sea Company. The new map itself here presented a more atmospheric depiction of South America, replacing his buccaneering insets that line the map with a perspectival vignette and elaborately designed cartouche here on the bottom right. The composition itself functioned as an unequivocal endorsement of Britain's intercolonial slave trade. On the right of the map, he illustrated Western Africa in greater detail. He labeled Sherbro Fort, which is in modern-day Sierra Leone, Cape Mesurado in modern-day Liberia, and Elmira Castle, Cape Coast Castle, illustrated here, and Fort Christiansborg in modern-day Ghana, which were ports of departure for European slaving ships destined for the Americas. These complexes here are interesting for me and not solely the ones dedicated to the slave trade, because they're very much built institutions that predate, say, the construction of the Bank of England in London, that encapsulate the realities of modern capitalism and global capitalism at the time, which is very much the foundation of the new project. On the left side of the print of the map, the map here on the left-hand side, he included a scene depicting the silver mines in Potosi and modern-day Bolivia, where Spanish settlers subjugated 30,000 Africans to drain the mountain of its reserves. In the cartouche on the lower right, certainly with a great deal of somewhat Rococo flair, the engraver turned to allegory to visualize the commercial relationship between Europe, allegorically referenced on the left, and South America, shown on the right-hand side. And tellingly, the engraver foregrounded the scene with silver coins and bars, the material resources to be gained by the partnership, and placed the actions and the horrors of human labor in the background. Likewise, in the image on the left-hand side, it's completely vacant of human forms, which I think is quite significant. Now, Moll's cartography and this kind of broader cartographic project itself exists at the intersection of geography and commerce, where the depiction of faraway lands functioned as commodities for a consumer and investor population. On his globes, the inclusion of the trade winds and Dampier's maritime route centered attention on the dehumanized mechanisms of trade and exchange. On the map of the South Sea Company, Moll located the meridian in London. You can see that here on the far right-hand side, which further anchored the composition in the British Empire's political and economic center. And his use of global projection, as opposed to the more utilitarian Mercator projection of his earlier charts, emptied the map of any perceived navigational function. In this regard, the curving lines of longitude, which granted the image the appearance of a globe, confirmed its status as a commercial as opposed to practical composition. Now, in London, fervent speculation in the South Sea Company generated unprecedented stock inflation by the early months of 1720. We can see here on the right-hand side is just the value of stock shares in the South Sea Company. Certainly this is understood as one of the world or the first global economic crises, because it reverberated all across modern Europe, transcending or crossing international boundaries. The company itself actually only made minimal advances in South American trading and consistently failed to fulfill its contractual obligations to the king, the Spanish king. And so the bursting of the speculative bubble unleashed a torrent of satirical images on the commercial print market. Now, engravers, somewhat comically, made repeated reference to globes, bubbles, and ships in an effort to deride the naive optimism and overseas speculation. You can see at the very top of this image, and it was kind of blowing bubbles into the wind, resembling globes, certainly. On the fringes of this print, this Dutch print, you can see Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, who ponders an overturned globe while a ship is violently tossed at sea. And in this regard, globes prove no more stable than bubbles, understood both physically and financially. And the upturned sphere and the capsizing vessel emphasized the risk of market gambling at home and abroad, certainly playing a kind of moralizing function. The cartographic depiction of faraway places, which long served to encourage European exploration and settlement, came under sharp critique. The investment in exotic island proved a fool's errand, was the message of another print, the one we see here. On the left, a frenzy of investors gamble on potential returns from a fictional island of Mad Head, illustrated here in the center, which is located in the satirical sea of shares. And the three rivers that come into the center of the island are aptly named the Thames, the Seine, and the Meuse, after the European cities most seduced by the stock market bubble. And these all form then, of course, the profile of a stock trader in a fool's cap. The image, of course, parodied the frontispiece of Sir Thomas More's Utopia from the 16th century to ridicule European aspirations and assumptions regarding global expansion. Distant islands, in this case, were no more suitable for financial investment as they were for idealized colonies or commonwealths. Now, to their part, English commentators derided the greed that overtook the city of London. One print turned to rhyme to moralize the South Sea Company's deception to the Honorable South Sea Company at Mockingly Estates, here across the top. And the left, actually, cartographically represented, is the island of St. Kitts, over which Britain gained control following this War of Spanish Succession. And the plate reads, if we look here at the bottom, in miniature, behold your South Sea fleet, bound from St. Kitts to carry on the cheat, as if the crafty scheme at first was laid to turn to private use or foreign trade. Now, the words, of course, critique the private investor's attempt at personal gain, and the image shed lights then on the horrors of the company's trading operations. During the early modern period, St. Kitts was one of the foremost destinations for slaving vessels, owing to its status as a plantation island for sugar production, illustrated by the image here on the left. The legacy of this system, and the system here on the right-hand side is a plantation, a sugar plantation from the 18th century. The legacy of this system, which fueled European commerce through the speculative investment through resource extraction, colonial trade, and human trafficking, is certainly resonates today. Noting Carol Walker's remarkable installation at the Domino Sugar Refinery in New York in 2014. The large sculpture shown here on the right, of course, which is made of sugar and carved in the form of a sphinx of exaggerated African features, highlights the materiality of the intercolonial slave trade and the economic desires that fueled its operations, certainly discerned through its full title called A Subtlety of the Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino Sugar Refinery plant. And of course, the Carol Walker herself included figures of 15 Blackmore attendants made in China, further reinforces the enduring connections between capitalism and systems of inequality. Now, Moll's cartographic enterprise continued long after the bursting of the South Sea bubble. Although he discontinued the manufacture of pocket gloves around 1720, the objects remained in vogue until the middle of the 18th century. Swift, though often critical of Moll's many geographic errors, nevertheless pilfered his maps for his Gulliver's Travels, which was published in 1726. And Defoe, his book, A New Voyage Around the World of 1724, which is widely believed to be a renewed proposal for a South Sea trading scheme, similar made use of his books, of the cartographer's books and images. Yet the cartographer's publication contained inaccuracies that thwarted the feasibility of the plan, specifically the existence of the Andes, where Defoe planned a trading route here at the bottom of South America, or at the south of South America. So ships, trading posts, and stock exchanges function as the built infrastructure that supported the development of speculative capitalism during the early modern period. And as portable commodities intended for the upwardly mobile, pocket globes, illustrated here, of course, on the right, similarly functioned as commercial goods that, for many 18th century Britons, presented the world as a network of resources by which one could profit through investment. In this regard, the charting of maritime journeys across the surface of Moll's globe could not innocently suggest the wonder of nautical adventure, kind of Daniel Defoe of sorts. Instead, it marked the embrace of an economic system for which domestic prosperity and luxury consumption relied on stock market returns, dependent as they were on imperial expansion and the subjugation of human life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, for your illuminating presentation. To everyone out there joining us right now, you can please type your questions in the chat. We have about 15, 20 minutes for conversation. Alternatively, you can identify yourself in the chat as someone who wants to ask a question, and we can unmute you. While people are sort of mulling it over and typing things, because I know this is often how it works, I am super fascinated, Jason, not only in the history that you've offered, connecting all these places and people and systems, but the objects themselves, these sort of the relationship of these handheld, these little miniature globes with all of the imagery, the representations that were created to sort of help fuel the speculation and justify certain geopolitical and economic systems. And I was wondering, in your research, I know it's ongoing and sort of it's at its early stages, but in terms of how people talked about, if at all, if you can find records of sort of even in like newspaper or magazine journals, or in some of those satirical cartoons or diaries that maybe have been found, how people talk about and sort of interacted with these objects, because they're so tactile in a way that maps have a different kind of, you have a different relationship to a map, sort of the unfolding and sort of tucking away or putting on a wall. But these little globes, because there are so many other examples of these sort of miniaturization during this time and even earlier. So it'd be great to maybe hear a little bit more about your findings. And then, oh, Joseph, did you want to also ask a question right now, or?
Well, I do have a question, but you can, if Jason wants to answer your question first, that would be fun.
Okay.
Sure thing. No, certainly. And Moll, the cartographer here, was certainly not the only one. He was not the first one. These kind of pocket globes themselves date back to around to the 17th century. They were Dutch. One ultimately traces them back as a Dutch invention. I don't know if we want to use that term. So certainly I don't want to draw a causal relationship that simply the kind of miniaturizations of the world directly contributed to certain kinds of financial, economic, dehumanizing systems, although in this case it certainly does. No, I think like this, it's fascinating, right? Like these, certainly there's a lot of interest in the kind of miniaturizations on multiple different scales. Certainly Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels relies on scale as a way to make like kind of critical commentary there on kind of much more moral grounds. Where a lot of these objects themselves, I guess like one thing that interested me about them is that they were not scholarly, right? In their assembly themselves, the way that they would be, they were made of paper mache and were like, I think they're, maybe you can see it on the right-hand side. They were often like assembled pretty, I don't want to say like sloppily, but like not always like super precise. So they were certainly not intended for a scholarly audience. Certainly one could be scholarly and own one, but they were popular commodities, right? They certainly didn't play a role in geographic scholarship. Much of what we know, they're pretty rare. If you like Google them, you'll find them usually on Sotheby's or something like that, being sold at auction. But most of what we know about them is through, or a lot of what we know about them are known through manuals. The manuals that would come when you would purchase one of them, of how you could use it. For instance, one manual from later in the 18th century recommended, right, like, and this is where its role in education is really explicit, is that they recommend holding it on a string and like you would like go around a candle to like mimic or to kind of mimic the heliocentric revolution around circulation around the sun. So certainly they played like educational. They were used as educational tools. I would love to, if there were kind of documentation, and certainly this work is ongoing, of like them being used at a like investment, them being used for very specific purposes tied to financial speculation. Certainly that would work well to my case. But what I do think that they do is they certainly, as miniaturizations of the world, illustrate this kind of network that exists, that's tying the world together, or tying Europe to the rest of the world, certainly through navigation and exchange. And the kind of charting across the globe certainly illustrates that, of kind of nautical journeys. I'm trying to think of what else you would ask. You would ask something else in that as well.
Well, I think it's also interesting, like they're both sort of, it's about commodification and consumerism and sort of the rise of the middle class, and sort of the idea that even, if you're middle class, you could invest and become a shareholder, but that like that sort of tempered, or like, how does that interact with the almost sort of sloppy construction and almost a childlike kind of it's really like, I think it's a super fascinating topic, because they're not like, really precious objects, but they are expensive, but they almost have that kind of mass produced quality. Like they're not mass produced, but there's almost this like suggestion. It's like, I got it out of my Cracker Jack box,
The thing that I find interesting, that's exactly what I find so fascinating about them, because unlike like the super rarefied, like if you get a book on globes, which I might have in my bag, like right over here, if you go to these huge scholarly globes that would certainly have been used by members of the academy, right? They were super expensive, super rare, but these themselves, right? They were certainly not cheap, but they were also not so expensive that no one could afford them. And they function as these objects, and these very unique objects that, while celebrating the emergence or the development of consumerism, which in the literature in 18th century history and culture, the emergence of British consumerism is viewed as a kind of watershed moment or watershed phenomenon that gives birth to modernity in many ways, right? We could think any kind of teleological arguments about consumerism more generally, but shows a kind of weakening of certain kinds of systems of authority, religious or otherwise. And these objects serve like to mediate or move between, like, signal the kind of emergence of consumerism while also pointing to the kind of horrific activities, whether it's colonialism, settlement in the Americas, certainly, which we think about quite a lot here, and certainly the slave trade, that they actually signal both of those things. You know, I think if you go into many of the kind of demonstrations that have unfolded over the last few years, you know, there are many instances of tying capitalism to racism, et cetera. And I think with this instance here, we have an object that directly links those two issues, right? It's not metaphorical, it's not conceptual, it's like very, very much there, and ties these two systems that I think we still live with today, you know, whether it's buying things off of Amazon or whatnot, and how this object themselves literally kind of connects those two worlds.
That's great, thank you. Joseph has a question, so you've already unmuted yourself.
Great, thank you very much. Jason, I really enjoyed that. You laid out a very interesting and ambitious but fascinating project, and so many incredible images and objects. I was curious because it occurred to me that the period that you're focusing on in the early 18th century was also the period when what I have always thought of as the first global history of architecture was written. Fischer von Erlach's a book on history of architecture of the world. And this is in some ways sort of the beginning of a project that continues through people like Gottfried Semper in the 19th century, and then as we know is a very, very big topic today. So I guess I wanted to ask you about whether you see the attempt to along with the desire to have a kind of world picture, as Heidegger would say, in the form of a globe, if there's a connection there to also the desire to learn about or to study the architecture of the world. And it occurred to me, it actually occurred to me, I looked up the website of the organization, a Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, which is an organization I've been involved in. And on the front page is a globe, is a big globe. And I know, which is very important to the leaders of that project, that you can be able easily to visualize global connections between things. And so I'm curious if there is it would be nice for us to think that sort of contemporary efforts are completely different from any kind of idea of global, visualizing global relationships of the 18th and 19th centuries. But I wonder if it's so easy to separate these things, or if you think your project might actually have some critical implications for the desire to visualize the globe that we have even in our own discipline.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Oddly enough, I hadn't, through all of this, had never thought of Fischer von Erlach, never thought about him. No, it's true. Obviously, I find Fischer von Erlach super fascinating, and the kind of conversations, certainly on the global as a category. I'd have to think about that a little bit. Certainly one of the things I've been thinking about with this project, is certainly, it draws heavily off of kind of like certain kind of network theory, whether that's Latour, Keller Easterling, or otherwise. And I've been thinking about these kind of networks, these flows, and the kind of material foundation of these networks as it's discerned, or as it's like demarcated on these actual kind of globes themselves, and how this works on like financial grounds. I don't think, at this point, I haven't thought that much about kind of certain stylistic questions, which I certainly think are interesting and important, and certainly could offer like a kind of a commentary or engagement with the kind of questions with Fischer von Erlach, through Semper, et cetera. Maybe you and I can talk about that further. No, I'm not exactly entirely sure how I want to think about that, because I've been thinking a little bit, you have throughout what I'm interested in, or the architectural things that I find myself drawn to, are these entrepôts, these kind of trading posts that are scattered all throughout, and certainly in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Americas. I'm not going to study all of them. That's ridiculous. That would be a little too ambitious. But I'm a bit curious, what are the connections between these kind of like the organizations of space, questions of marketability, market value, whatever those objects are, and the stock exchange back in Europe, the development of the stock exchange. But that might be a really interesting way, specifically through maybe questions of decoration, through questions of formal massing or something, like to understand how those references are brought together. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's like certainly worth thinking about more seriously. So thank you.
Thanks.
So there was a question from Patricia Jackson from a little 10 minutes ago, so I don't know, but it says, was there a similar movement in Northern Europe, the Briggen, in terms of sort of like as you're doing maybe it's a question about the other case studies that you're looking at, and sort of thinking about commodities, these sort of luxury objects. Is that close to what you were thinking about, Patricia? Not sure.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. Oh, were there similar, was there a similar movement in Northern Europe, the Briggen? And I think Patricia was asking you maybe about the sort of expanded scope of your research project. Today you were looking more specifically at London, but you also mentioned Amsterdam, but thinking about Northern Europe, were there similar sort of kind of tendencies, financial instruments and related commodity sort of culture? I guess.
I mean, I'm sure there are. I did bring like, some of the images, these I didn't show, these are like my backup pocket. Certainly some of these, this is Dutch, so certainly this doesn't answer the question, but about like, kind of the explosion of global commodities and interest in kind of globalism across Europe. Certainly there's so much there. For the future project, I do envision myself, I am an architectural historian. It's kind of funny. It's like my way of kind of thinking through some of the architectural questions. I turn to cartography and a non-architectural object to kind of think about it. So I see myself in the future, as I think about it, looking at the kind of architecture itself, or these built ports. Certainly there are a number of commodities that are illustrated here on the left-hand side. This being from the interior of a Dutch shop trading in Asian goods. Whether it's the actual material itself that was treated. The thing that I guess I'm interested in for the expanded project, and why London and Amsterdam function as so important or so central here, is because like these are the institutions that where the stock exchange is established. So you have like this venue, this architectural venue or spatial venue, where objects themselves are assessed, like a value is ascribed to them, and then investors in Europe can invest in them. So you have like, it's credit effectively. It's like the way that credit is a part of this. Certainly there's a kind of commodity culture that I think could be explored deeper in terms of kind of grappling with the kind of globalization. I suppose for my interest and where I'm going further with it, I think it'll kind of focus on these places where there is this kind of the development of a kind of questions of credit. Because it's both like, in many ways, credit is both like material and material. There's a kind of I don't want to say it's like mathematical. It's certainly not. Ink has been spilled that this is not while this maybe is like a prehistory of probability or theories of probability, they were not doing it intentionally for that, but where there's a kind of development of a credit economy where people are kind of like envisioning the future, or envisioning like the global, and envisioning like the kind of wealth that they could have. I kind of find that disjoint financially and otherwise between like domestic prosperity and the kind of actions that are happening internationally. But as I said, this is the first stab at this project, so we'll see where it goes.
There's another question from Vivian Lee asking about, at what point does cartography take on scientific rigor? Like, I guess, what is the consensus among historians, perhaps? I think, because it's a tricky question.
Well, let me just,
or you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm going to follow up. Sorry, it's hard to type when I'm on a phone, but what I wanted to ask was just, I really enjoyed your lecture, Jason, and it was kind of illuminating with the documents that you showed how kind of allowable distortion and bias in early cartography is, especially with kind of narrative elements of perspective or kind of focus. And so at what, I guess I didn't realize how kind of allowed or understood by the general public that was, and that almost maps become incredibly rich in their kind of narrative potential. But in line of all this, I was just curious at what point, I mean, like, do we, understanding that it's still a distorted, even the globe or any form of globe is still a distortion at this point. At what point was there an effort to try to aim for that kind of scientific clarity of the physicalities of the world? And like, how does that map into history and time even?
Right. One of the things, I suppose this is maybe like the Mercator projection, which is, I mean, much ink has been spilled on how this is functioning. It's effectively, right, like the Mercator projection, the map itself here on the left, it acknowledges the kind of distortion of cartography, because what it does, it takes, which you can illustrate it here on the bottom right-hand side, like how a globe in lines of longitude itself, and just completely flattens it out, right? I mean, certainly, Google Maps no longer even presents cartography like this. It kind of certainly privileges, certain geographies over other geographies. One of the things that's interesting is that this map itself, when it was developed, and one of its really important functional purposes, which I think does nod to kind of like questions of scientific rigor or mathematical understandings of space, is that the reason Mercator projection, or the technical or kind of functional reason why it was valued, is that because you could draw, like if you were a navigator, if you were a shipper, you could draw on a map like a line of bearing, like how you would sail. You could draw it as a straight line, right? I think on this map here, which is certainly a Mercator projection, you see these ships and you would get these charts, these maps that were distinguished from maps. They were called charts. And they were nautical charts of like how shippers would understand the space. You can imagine, right, if you have like a line that goes anywhere, right? Like if you are a shipper and you have like a straight line on a globe or on a kind of accurate map that was like an accurate depiction of space, whatever that means, like that line would curve, right? Because it like curves it, even like, unless you're like due north, it's always going to like kind of curve around and like spiral toward the North Pole or the South Pole or wherever. So in a way, it's kind of a paradox that these kind of the maps themselves, which were the most kind of scientific, that being said, that they had the most amount of like mathematical calculations, or there were most amount of like kind of mathematical or kind of geometrical calculations, were the ones that were the most distorted, because they kind of flattened out the entire globe on a pictorial plane. So it's kind of a paradox, which I think is interesting here, because like on the maps, then when you have like a map, and whether he did it intentionally or not, I'm not entirely sure, but in certain maps, such as this early one, which is, he uses Mercator projection, which kind of gives the map this kind of almost like utilitarian view. It makes it seem more utilitarian because, right, it's dedicated, or it's like a navigator in theory could use it. But then in certain other maps, when it kind of is, you have here, it's like almost recreating, it's atmospheric, it's called global projection, which I suppose Google Maps is this now. It almost is more like, I was thinking of it, and maybe this is too simplistic and probably is that it's like more overtly commercial, right? Because it's trying to like evoke this kind of image of the globe, but it's certainly not useful, right? Like not like one could not use this to kind of measure space. Like a version of this map is like the cartographic version of a perspective drawing, right? It's like, it shows the image, or it shows the world, but like paradoxically is not that useful for actually understanding the mathematical dimensions of space. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but it's certainly how I was kind of thinking about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have one final question, I think because we're slightly over time, from David Lieberman as a follow-up to Joseph's question. So David.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, Erica. Really follow up to both Joseph and to Vivian. If Joseph looked for an ambition to architectural history and inclusivity, and Vivian in her reference to narrative, might we go back a previous century to your miniature globes or worlds? To I think of someone like Fra Mauro in the development of his Mappa Mundi, who the inclusivity and remembering that this map was drawn only from the stories and gifts of travelers with the ambition of that understanding of the world, because Fra Mauro never left his cell on the Isle of San Michele in the Venetian lagoon. And I think it's a wonderful kind of precursor to the expansive condition. And it might be very interesting to see then where your work takes you in terms of the 18th, 19th, 20th, and then arguably the reversal that is occurring in the 21st century.
No, that's true. That's fascinating. That's super fascinating. Thank you for that recommendation to like think about that. I hadn't thought about that as much, because certainly you see here, you know, Herman Moll, this cartographer, he was German by birth, so I should say he wasn't British. He was German by birth, but he emigrates to Britain certainly as kind of like, has a very perspective, like kind of very specific Eurocentric and Anglocentric view of the world, that's for sure, but certainly never leaves Europe, right? He's not going to South America, et cetera. I mean, not like Theodore de Brie, who's kind of traveling throughout the world or experiencing things. And so it's interesting to think like, right, like how do you incorporate certain kind of questions of like stories, narratives? I mean, certainly there are tons of kind of travel narratives themselves. Barbara Shapiro, a historian, right? She writes about like kind of how cartography at this moment kind of is function, like at least within some of these kinds of stories, these kind of travel stories, travel narratives, which I think is kind of interesting to think about. The role of cartography and specificity within questions of observation, empiricism, et cetera, kind of give a kind of like function in the construction of the modern fact, like how do you actually know something and claim something as a fact? But I think it's interesting and important to kind of, might be interesting as you signal, right, to kind of push against that and to like think about certain kind of like other kinds of narratives that illustrate kind of the imagination. Certainly that's a prehistory to Swift, certainly I would think. So I think that that's really interesting. So thank you for that reference.
Great, thank you.
So I wanted to thank you everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to Jason for this lecture, Globe, Stock Markets and Speculative Capitalism. We would also like to thank our Daniels Public Programming Committee for organizing this year's series. To see the rest of the Daniels events this year, all you have to do is head over to the Daniels website and go to News and Events. The next event in the series, Island, Desert, Mountain, Forest by Luis Callejas, is coming up on Monday, this coming Monday, November 9th at 1 p.m. We hope to see you then. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye, everyone.